Want to welcome everybody that's joining Mass today via this live stream. My heart longs for all of you to be here with me. There's nothing more that I want than for all of this to pass and have each of you here safely to share with you one of the greatest gifts that we have, our Lord Jesus Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. But maybe this time of being apart from one another will help us grow in our longing for God as our spiritual food and to share and live the faith together in a greater way. This fourth Sunday of Lent addresses really the mix of interior experiences that we're likely having during this challenging time. The rose color that I wear today represents Laetare Sunday, the Sunday of rejoicing in the midst of all of our Lenten fasting, calling us to rejoice that God remains with us always. But it may be difficult to rejoice when our lives have been upended in so many ways. Our second reading, the responsorial psalm, the gospel, they all acknowledge that at times we walk in darkness and we can feel like we're going about blind. Indeed, as we're seeking at this time to care for our physical bodies and those of our neighbors, we also need to recognize the care that we need for our minds and our souls. I was reading an article earlier this week from some psychologists and psychiatrists who are already reporting the different signs of distress that are among those that are worried about all the consequences of COVID-19. Stress caused by the fear of this disease compounded with the isolation that we're practicing. Those who've lost family members or are anxious about loved ones that are more susceptible. Healthcare workers exhausting themselves in the time of crisis. Parents and teachers trying to continue the education of their children. Concerns for the loss of jobs and the financial impacts. There's different mental health experts encouraging things like limiting our intake of news to only like 1 or 2 times a day so that we limit that anxiety. Or focusing on comforting things, good movies, video chatting with family, going outside, connecting with nature since, it's a safe place that maybe too many of us have been too busy to really enjoy. To acknowledge when anxious thoughts come and then move from them quickly. Of course, to all this kind of advice comes even more that our faith gives to us. Since we, as humans, are both body and soul, this physical and mental health is intimately connected to also spiritual health. So last weekend, I connected this current situation to the Lenten series that I had begun, looking at St. Ignatius of Loyola's rules for the discernment of spirits. And we're discovering that, they're not so much rules that we're being forced to follow as these kind of unchanging, trustworthy principles that can help us understand the ups and the downs that we go through in our spiritual life, especially when so many other things seem to be so uncertain. These rules help us to recognize in the midst of the thoughts, emotions, the desires within us, what are consolations from God we should pay attention to? And what are those desolations, the temptations that the enemy wants to use? So the interior anxiety, the distress of today can get into us in a spiritual way and bring up desolation at the level of our relationship with God. Last weekend, I looked at St. Ignatius' fourth rule, which describes, through different examples, what this desolation can look like, this heaviness within our hearts, and how do we reject it. And so today we go to Ignatius' fifth rule, which is really the first of several of his principles, directly helping us understand how we should act in response to this kind of darkness. If you forget everything else from this series of discernment, remember this rule. If we remember it and follow it, live it out, it will bless us forever. So St. Ignatius in this rule says, in time of desolation, never make a change, but be firm and constant in the resolutions and determination in which one was before the desolation. So what he's saying there is we should never make a change, a spiritual change, in the time of desolation. So, for example, maybe it's a person that's worried about all the things going on in the world around us. There's a kind of darkness, a kind of grayness or heaviness within us, this anxiety. And maybe this person's used to praying, used to turning toward God, but now there's just a lack of energy for it. They're in a kind of desolation. And so this rule number 5 applies. In desolation, never make a change to a spiritual resolution. So maybe this person had planned to go to a Bible study, or to spend time in the morning in prayer, or to begin reading some kind of spiritual reading, or to live out Jesus' teaching of love for another in a very specific way. Maybe I decided to be involved in the parish in a new way, or all the different resolutions of prayer, fasting, almsgiving that we had decided for this season of Lent. When we're in desolation, we don't feel like doing any of these. But Ignatius says, never make a change. Never make a change. Maybe you had an appointment to meet with a priest because of some kind of spiritual struggle that was going on within you, but a phone call comes and your mind has this issue that's weighing heavy upon it. And in this heaviness, you think, why would I go see Father? Why waste his time? Nothing's really going to change by going and doing that. Maybe I'll just call him and cancel. No, don't make a change. Not in desolation. Go there. Maybe you said yes to going to retreat, and as the weekend arrives, the doubts come into the mind. Well, I'm a lot busier now, and the other things came up when I said that I could go before, so, maybe I'll just not go. No, don't make a change. Go exactly as planned. Now you might say, well, that sounds really good, Father, but how am I supposed to live out this rule? Never make a change. It seems like everything has been changed around me. Spiritual events are all canceled. We're not even allowed to be here this morning for Sunday Mass. And yeah, that's true. It can feel like all of our spiritual resolutions that we decided before this all happened have been changed for us. But we want to do our best not to change, to follow what Ignatius says. For we can easily, if we do so, fall into deeper isolation and desolation. We have to be more creative and intentional of maintaining the good spiritual practices that we had in our life before any of this occurred. And so that's why we have the live stream masses today. For we must not change our resolution to keep the Lord's Day holy. Maybe before all this, you were meeting with a Bible study or you had a small group. Keep that connection with them, even if you can't be there in person, over the phone or through video chat. And St. Ignatius gives us the reason why we're not to make spiritual changes in times when we're feeling as though God's far. He says, in consolation, it's the good spirit who guides and counsels us. In desolation, it's the bad spirit, with whose counsels we cannot decide rightly. So when we're in this kind of desolate state of feeling God's absence, it's going to be the evil one, the enemy, who's going to be trying to influence us and try to get us off track. He'll try to get us to go back on those good spiritual resolutions that we had previously made. So, for example, maybe during this time of not being able to go to Mass, you've made this resolution, well, I'm going to participate in the live stream Mass when it's live stream until, whenever we're allowed to come back together as a community. But, even as you do your best to participate, maybe if this has to go on for week after week, it doesn't feel the same as being here at church. And the thought maybe comes up, oh, why should I get up in the morning? Maybe I'll just watch it later. Or, it's not like I'm actually at Mass. The bishop gave us the dispensation of not having to go. don't make a change. Don't make a change to that initial resolution. Maybe it's, we decided to pray the rosary together as a family more often. But then it becomes so hard, sometimes with little kids, and the thought is, maybe we'll just stop. Don't stop. In the desolation, the thought will come, and maybe even it will seem really, really clear that I had it all wrong before. The decisions that I had made, that original decision, we should never have tried it. But remember that when we're in the darkness of desolation, we're kind of like that blind man in the gospel. We cannot see clearly, and the enemy is going to be influencing us to make those kinds of changes. We think that experience of desolation, that kind of downness within us will go away if we make those kinds of changes. But in reality, it won't. Maybe another example, we're doing all this social distancing as an act of charity towards our neighbors, community members that are especially vulnerable. But as time goes on, there's just this heaviness from it all that's within us. And we think, why am I doing all this? It's not that big of a risk for me. We think that interior desolation will go away if we just go back on those resolutions. But the way out of desolation is to remain faithful to our relationship with God. Only when we're experiencing God's closeness, his consolations, can we recognize the voice of the shepherd leading us, as the psalm spoke of today. If we persevere in our good resolutions, then God will break through. This is what happens in the gospel. Jesus came and he heals the blind man, restoring not just the physical sight, but a kind of spiritual vision where the man then recognizes Jesus as prophet, as teacher, and Lord. If we persevere through the difficult situation that we're going through right now, God can refresh our souls, even while we're experiencing all these external difficulties. Finally, even though St. Ignatius says that we must not change our spiritual resolutions, his next rule will actually speak about the changes that we ought to make. Changing ourselves, he says, intensely against the desolation. But that's going to be our topic for next Sunday. Going through all of these challenges, may we begin to grow to see our lives as God sees, and rejoice that he guides us through all things.